Everything changed the moment Justin Baldoni stood up not just for himself, but for every creator, every voice that had been silenced by the weight of Hollywood. Power, and what he did in that courtroom was nothing short of seismic. He called the bluff of Blake Lively's high-profile attorney with documents. Nobody expected receipts. The legal team swore didn't exist, and what followed wasn't just shocking, it was devastating, because in a single bold move, Justin didn't just protect the creators, he exposed the lies, the manipulation, the entire web. And when the judge leaned forward, the room holding its breath, something shifted forever. It began in silence. The kind of silence that comes before a storm, the kind that holds a room hostage as tension coils in the air. And in that courtroom packed with press lawyers, influencers, and onlookers, all eyes locked on Justin Baldoni as he stood up, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous. Resolve, because for months creators had whispered behind the scenes about the silence, the takedowns, the sudden demonetizations, the bizarre anonymous complaints, and the eerie coordination of it all. And now someone was finally pulling back the curtain. And it wasn't just anyone. It was the very man Blake Lively's legal team had tried to break, isolate, and discredit. But what they didn't realize was that every attack, every legal stunt, every buried subpoena had pushed Justin to this moment, to this day. And when he presented his first document, the courtroom leaned in, not out of curiosity, but out of dread, because no one expected him to bring evidence. Not like this, not digital logs, timelines, emails, and receipts that painted a chilling picture of influence, abuse, narrative manufacturing, and targeted silencing. And every name on those files had one thing in common: connection to Blake Lively, her legal team, or the network of shadow PR consultants that now stood accused of orchestrating a coordinated defamation and suppression campaign. And as the judge flipped through the documents, eyes narrowing, the room began to shift. The usual smirks from the defense faded, and even Blake's lawyer looked rattled, not because he didn't expect to be challenged, but because Justin wasn't supposed to win. He wasn't supposed to have proof, and yet here he was, pointing to metadata, email headers, IP addresses linked to burner accounts that had posted threads smearing creators days before takedowns began. He walked the court through time-stamped logs showing how creators were flagged internally by a third-party monitoring agency weeks before any alleged content violations ever occurred. And when asked why those names matched subpoenaed influencer logs from Blake's team, the room fell still, because the answer was clear. The targets had been chosen, and one by one they were silenced. And then Justin dropped something even heavier: a call log obtained legally between a consultant and an unknown associate discussing the strategy for phase 2 of what they called creator nullification. And that phrase alone was enough to send reporters scrambling for coverage notes, because it wasn't just a smear campaign. It was a strategy, a playbook designed to eliminate voices deemed inconvenient. And the worst part, it wasn't theoretical, it happened, and Justin had the proof. And with every new slide projected on the courtroom screen, screenshots from private chats, emails referencing creators by name and suggesting tactics like algorithm flooding and coordinated reporting. The defense grew visibly uncomfortable, and when they tried to object, the judge shut it down, stating, "The court will hear the full scope of these allegations as they pertain to procedural abuse and potential witness intimidation." And that's when Justin looked at Blake, not with hatred, not with fear, but with clarity, and said, "This isn't about personal vengeance, this is about accountability. And for too long your name has shielded actions that would destroy anyone else, and now it's time for the truth to speak louder than your image." And those words reverberated across social media live streams, cutting in every major outlet, picking it up, creators quoting it like a battle cry. And the momentum turned, because what started as a lawsuit had become something else entirely, a reckoning. And still there was more. Justin then presented subpoenaed payment records showing undisclosed transactions from Blake's charitable foundation to a shell PR entity listed in prior filings as merely a consultant, but whose actual business was influence management and crisis redirection. And among those payments were specific line items labeled strategic narrative services with dates that matched major creator takedowns, and one entry was for a 6-figure some days before a group of creators received coordinated copyright strikes and cease and desist notices. And the judge asked plainly, "Do you believe these payments were made to silence these voices?" And Justin answered directly, "I believe they were made to control the narrative, and that control came at the cost of truth, fairness, and creator livelihoods." And now the courtroom was fully on edge, the defense scrambling to request a recess, the judge denying it, stating, "We will not delay accountability any further." And Justin continued detailing how his own platform was shadow banned, how posts mentioning the lawsuit were throttled, how even content unrelated to Blake began disappearing, and how whistleblowers from inside a moderation firm confirmed that content filtering requests were submitted externally from a legal office linked to the actress, and he showed screenshots of these internal tickets with requester emails redacted, but the domains matched, and one was accidentally left intact and it belonged to a paralegal from Blake's team. And that one mistake unraveled everything, because now there was a direct line between legal influence and content suppression, a weaponization of policy designed not to protect truth but to erase dissent. And Justin didn't stop there. He then played a voice message left on a creator's voicemail by a private investigator threatening escalation unless a particular post was removed, and when traced back, the phone number matched a digital forensics firm under contract with the same legal team, and the investigator's name appeared in 2 previous defamation suits, both tied to reputation management for high-profile clients, and the implication was clear. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern, and when asked why he kept going even after multiple attempts to silence him, Justin said, "Because if I stop now, they win, and if they win, we all lose." And you could feel the air shift, because now the case was no longer about Blake or Justin. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel like their voice didn't matter, like their truth could be buried under celebrity and legal muscle. And Justin stood for all of them with nothing but documents, determination, and truth, and it worked. Because the judge ordered an evidentiary review of the claims and stated that the court would consider sanctions if the documents proved systemic abuse. And as Justin stepped down, the gallery erupted, not in noise but in tension, the kind that only comes when something seismic is unfolding. And as Blake's lawyer whispered furiously to his team, the cameras outside caught a glimpse of a headline already flashing across screens everywhere. Justin Baldoni flips the script, calls legal bluff, exposes Hollywood smear machine, and if this was just part 1, the world could only imagine what would come next. The next morning came like thunder. No sunrise, just headlines flooding every feed, every screen, every platform. Justin Baldoni had done what no one thought possible, and the system was rattling under the weight of what he unearthed. And while most people were still piecing together the memo logs and metadata, others were already tracing the ripples, because the story wasn't just about a celebrity trying to protect her image. It was about power, how it's used, how it's hidden, and how easily it can corrupt. And now everyone wanted to know more, because what else was buried and who else was involved? And the answer came sooner than expected, as more creators came forward, empowered by the documentation shared in court, and soon the judge had to authorize protective measures for incoming whistleblowers, because the scope had officially ballooned beyond any single narrative. And it was in that moment that a second cache of evidence surfaced, not from Justin but from an anonymous insider. The drop landed in the inbox of one of the court's digital forensic consultants, and it contained uncompressed audio snippets, contract drafts, and a document labeled Phase 3 Remediation. And what it detailed was chilling: an entire calendar of PR moves, legal maneuvers, influencer outreach, and behind it all, a team coordinating responses from shadow accounts, even pre-writing tweets for verified creators to use once Phase 3 began. And the documents included proof of message testing campaigns, where multiple tweet versions would be soft-launched under bot accounts to measure virality before passing them to real influencers. And the plan was clear: control the conversation, hijack the outrage, and guide the public through a curated storm, one that left Blake clean and every critic in the mud. And the worst part, it had worked for a time, until Justin pulled the cord and the curtain began falling. And in the audio files, one consultant could be heard saying, "The actor doesn't know what she started, she's risking the firewall." And the analyst who decrypted the files testified that firewall referred to the protective boundary between plausible deniability and exposed coordination. And now that boundary had crumbled, because one file name caught everyone's iClient_master_brief_BL docs, and within it a section titled Narrative Protection Points, and the bullet points were surgical: first, redirect to unrelated positive press; second, imply mental health strain; third, reference children; fourth, threat creator credibility; fifth, loop and platform support. And under each point were checkboxes, some marked as completed with date stamps and initials, and while some were redacted, a few weren't, and those initials matched people already named in earlier filings. And as the prosecution revealed the document, the courtroom felt electric, like every light was flickering with the weight of truth. And then came a video clip recorded in a casual setting, someone's phone camera tilted on a couch, 2 voices One male, one female discussing how to shut down a channel not just with reports but by seeding copyright claims through a third-party firm, and the male voice matched the one from the voicemail Justin had exposed earlier, and that was enough for the judge to request a direct subpoena for the third-party firm, and the lawyer for Blake objected hard, claiming the material was unauthenticated. But the metadata confirmed the video had been recorded during the time frame outlined in the Phase 3 document, and the female voice said clearly, "Do we have cover from the legal team?" And the response was, "Yeah, we've got that memo," and the phrase "that memo" triggered a firestorm because the court wanted to know what memo and why it hadn't been disclosed, and under threat of contempt the legal team admitted that a strategic liability briefing had been circulated but claimed it was privileged, and that opened a new debate, one that involved possible obstruction, and the judge paused, leaned forward and said the court is not a vault for secrecy. It is a mechanism for truth, and truth requires transparency, and that statement exploded across the internet, trending globally with commentators calling it the moment the system began fighting back. And as the judge reviewed every new exhibit, the defense's posture collapsed from confidence to containment, and in a desperate move they filed an emergency motion for partial dismissal, citing reputational damage and media interference. But the judge denied it again, saying reputational damage is not a shield from accountability, especially when self-inflicted. And in the hallway outside the courthouse, cameras captured Justin hugging a fellow creator, both of them visibly emotional. Not with victory but with relief, because for the first time, the tactics they had only suspected were now confirmed and documented and laid bare before the world. And as more documents leaked, including an internal checklist titled Creator to Value sequence listing named states, platforms, and response codes, people began connecting the dots, and creators who had been sneered to platform silence saw their names in cold black ink and realized it had all been by design and not some accident or algorithm quirk. And one of those creators, a woman who had gone dark after receiving threats and takedown notices, returned with a video watched over 2 million times in 12 hours where she read the entry that had been written about her. And as she broke down, the internet broke with her, and support poured in like a flood. Hashtags surged, trends shifted, and suddenly, it wasn't just a courtroom fight, it was a cultural awakening, a revelation of how narratives are built, bought, and weaponized. And still the story wasn't done, because Justin had one more card, and it came in the form of a sealed affidavit from a former assistant within Blake's team who claimed she was ordered to coordinate message approvals not just with consultants but with platform liaisons, and she named 2 of them, both employed at major social media companies. And suddenly it wasn't just about Blake anymore, it was about an entire infrastructure of suppression, one that blurred the line between PR strategy and digital warfare. And when the affidavit was read in court, the tension cracked, the silence broke, and the judge ordered a special review, stating, "These allegations strike at the heart of free speech and legal ethics and must be reviewed without bias or delay." And so part 2 ended not with resolution but with eruption, the kind that signals that the house is no longer just on fire, it's collapsing. And as creators across platforms posted their truths, retold their trauma, reclaimed their narratives, one phrase kept rising above the noise: Justin was right, and now nothing will be the same again. There was no way to rewind what had happened, no chance to undo the flood once it started. And by now the media wasn't just covering the case, it was living inside it. Creators, former collaborators, industry insiders, they weren't waiting for verdicts anymore, they were testifying in the open. And it wasn't because they wanted revenge, it was because they were tired of pretending. Tired of the silence, tired of playing by rules designed to be broken by the powerful. And one voice broke louder than most, a former executive from a streaming platform who claimed they'd been pressured not to promote content from creators marked problematic by the very campaign now under fire. And that list, the problematic list, was included in the files exposed earlier with initials, matchups, and coordinated notes describing how to deprioritize visibility. And the executive said, "We weren't just moderating, we were burying people." And the courtroom shifted again, because this wasn't just about PR or smear anymore. This was systemic throttling of speech through partnership manipulation, and that testimony was followed by a string of emails marked privilege that somehow made it to the prosecution's bench, and once verified they were read aloud in court, each one darker than the last one, from a high-level legal advisor stating directly, "The best defense is destruction, not defense." Another where a name was circled in red, and beside it written, "Silence at any cost." And in one chilling exchange, 2 team members discussed targeting a creator's business partner through public allegations if they refused to pull a video. And while the defense continued to push back, the judge was no longer buying the denials, the delays, or the deflection. He had heard enough and called for an evidentiary review that would extend beyond the current hearing and into the operations of the firm itself, and that was unprecedented because now the court was examining not just a case but a culture. And meanwhile, Justin Baldoni continued to hold his ground, not as a savior but as someone who had once trusted the system until he saw how badly it failed, and now every day he walked into court was another step against the myth that celebrities couldn't be challenged. In a powerful moment, he read a message from a small creator who said, "I was going to quit until you spoke, and I realized I wasn't crazy and I wasn't alone," and the judge allowed it into the record because it captured what so many were feeling. This wasn't just about law. This was about lived experience. And then another video surfaced, one that hadn't been intended for court but was submitted anyway by a staffer who had once worked on a campaign involving Blake, and in the video, a senior PR manager laughs and says, "This isn't cancel culture, it's curated collapse, and we're really good at it." And that phrase, curated collapse, became the headline overnight because it revealed the machinery behind the madness. And that same staffer later shared a spreadsheet categorizing creators by risk value with suggested suppression strategies next to each name, and when cross-referenced with actual takedowns and video removals, there was correlation after correlation too tight to ignore, and the platforms had no choice but to respond. But their statements were vague boilerplate, promising reviews but avoiding blame, and that only fueled the fire because now people wanted names, wanted accountability, wanted change, not platitudes. And amid the chaos, Blake Lively remained silent, and that silence began speaking louder than any statement could, because as more people came forward, as the timeline of influence abuse grew thicker, as the dots connected into a pattern so precise it looked designed, her refusal to engage began to look like confirmation. And when her attorney finally issued a statement, it was defensive, clipped, and focused more on perceived media bias than the mountain of evidence. And that statement was torn apart online, dissected word for word, mocked and dismantled because people weren't buying narratives anymore, they were demanding truth. And so came another twist, a deposition transcript leaked from months earlier where one of Blake's advisors admitted they had been warned about the potential blowback of these tactics, but said the goal was control, not consensus. And when asked why they continued, they replied, "Because silence is compliance, and our client did not want to be silent anymore." And that turned everything inside out, because if silence was compliance and Blake was no longer silent, then what exactly was she endorsing? What had she chosen? What lines had she agreed to cross? And while the court tried to stay focused, the walls were closing in on every side. More subpoenas issued, more firms dragged into the fray. A major talent agency called to testify, a crisis management firm scrambling to shield itself from civil liability. And in the midst of it all, Justin Baldoni remained unmoved, calling for transparency, not just in the courtroom but in the industry itself, saying if this is how people are treated for telling the truth, then the whole foundation needs to break and rebuild. And people listened because he wasn't speaking as a star. He was speaking as someone who had seen the monster behind the mirror and chose to fight it. And the weight of what he said hung heavy across every frame, every story, every update. Because now people weren't just watching a trial, they were watching the collapse of an illusion. And in the final moments of that day, the prosecution introduced a final exhibit for review, a communication log between a digital suppression team and a legal oversight advisor. And in one of the messages, dated 6 weeks before the scandal broke, the advisor writes, "If the pressure spikes, trigger." And in the end, it wasn't about headlines, fame, or even justice in the way courts defined it. It was about truth, raw and unfiltered, finally breaking through the silence, not whispered in backrooms or buried beneath legal spin, but shouted loud by those who refused to disappear. And when the dust settled and Blake Lively's carefully controlled image stood exposed, when the courtroom turned from spectacle to reckoning, when creators who were once targeted rose to become voices for millions, something bigger than any lawsuit was born. A line had been crossed and a message delivered loud and clear: no amount of power, wealth, or reputation can erase the truth when the people stand together. This wasn't just a victory, it was a warning. The age of silent takedowns is over and the era of accountability has begun.